The true cost of owning versus renting in Australia. I saved some $70,000 renting versus owning an apartment in the 11 years I lived in Melbourne between 2007 and 2018. Well, actually I left Australia in 2012, but I modeled the figures for you if I had stayed there. This was one of the most important factors which allowed me to be financially independent today. I never committed to any sort of major debt. I did the maths and I am happily sharing it with you so you don't commit to a Godzilla-size home loan before understanding the true cost of home ownership in Australia. Having said this, very approach can be applied to many other Western countries on this planet when assessing if it makes sense to rent or buy. With the property bubble slowly deflating in Australia starting in 2018, the Australian dream of house ownership is dead and beyond resuscitation for many fellow Australians. This is thanks to several decades of the economy booming without a recession, a seemingly uncaring government, and a hyperactive construction, media, and real estate propaganda machinery. You see, I knew back in 2007 that something was off in the valuation of property, shortly after I joined the workforce as a young management consultant. To illustrate, I was in the top 15% of taxpayers from the get-go, but several years after starting to work, increasing my salary significantly to the top 1% of taxpayers. I noticed that while saving up for a deposit I could barely afford a tiny one-bedroom apartment working a top job for top dollar. This was a big red flag to me. But before we go into the math on how I saved so much, a little bit of history to enlighten you how shit hit the fan in Australia. During the global financial crisis, GFC, of 2008/2009, Australia didn't go into recession. How? Why? This can't be, I was thinking to myself, holding out on the property purchase and observing against all advice I was given, especially by financial planners and real estate gurus. Get in early, don't miss out. Home prices will always increase in Australia because of immigration were typical phrases you heard every day. One person shared advice with me to borrow as much as you can, it will pay off. I was young, dumb, and naive then, and I almost fell for it, I have to admit, watching the ever-increasing property prices while I was paying off somebody's mortgage renting. I didn't understand at first how Australia managed to get through the global recession unharmed versus the rest of the world. Everything is connected, right? Today I do understand. I understand so much that I utilized this knowledge to fast-track my own financial independence a few years ago at age 34. The main reason for rising house prices. I only learned after the GFC that the main reason for not going into recession was due to the government opening up borders and regulations to let foreign investors in. Billions of dollars, some honestly earned and some less so, I guess, poured into the Australian property market from overseas investors. The government made a killing on pricey stamp duties and the construction business continued to boom. In my humble opinion, the Australian government had sold out its people to predominantly Asian investors that wanted to protect their capital from the crisis which they were experiencing in their own countries. It looked fantastic on paper when Australia announced not to have gone into recession. Everybody was tapping themselves on their shoulders. However, as it turned out, this came at the cost of shutting many doors for Australians who experienced a well over 15% drop, from close to 75% to 65%, in homeownership rates since the crisis, while the average household debt as percent of GDP increased by a majestic 50%, from 80% to 120% of GDP. 30% of Australians experience mortgage stress today, meaning the struggle with the costs to service the banking industry's loans. This has been coupled with a very significant drop in lifestyle quality for many Australians who till today are paying for their government's decision to open up the doors to foreign investors. I left in 2012 to continue my life and career overseas because I couldn't stand watching this anymore. The mother of all bubbles. Properties bubbled up in value way too fast following the government's decision. Counting on every increasing capital gains, it spiraled completely out of control to the point that it was common to hear about overseas investors paying cash at property auctions outbidding Australians sometimes by more than 50%, regularly by 20 to 30%. The common Joe reacting by offering more and more just to get into the market. Whether this is true or not, I don't really know, as I didn't participate in those questionable but very common property auctions, especially in Sydney and Melbourne. In fact, I stopped caring about the market completely for a while, being fed up with the news. One thing is for sure, however, property prices escalated versus real wage growth, to the point that the 2018 Australian Royal Commission found that well over 20% of Australian home buyers would fabricate income and expense statements to get loans approved and get into the market. Meanwhile, the lenders, aka banks, my favorite professionals I want nothing to do with, allowed people to get into debt that they cannot possibly afford while cashing in billions in commissions. Australians, today, have a staggering $360 billion in interest-only (IO) loans. This is roughly a fourth of all home loans, with the bulk expiring in 2018 and 2019 and more to come in the 2 years following. This is a country of 25 million people, but only a third having mortgages. The proportions are stifling in global comparison. At the same time, the Chinese government made it much more difficult for Chinese money to leave China, with the Chinese having been the #1 overseas investor in Australian property for years. Interest rates have been at record low levels and will have to rise to avoid the devaluation of the Australian dollar now to keep inflation in check. China, being Australia's main trading partner, is also experiencing significant difficulties. All along, the US and Europe are signaling a slowdown in business activities going forward. Low Australian rental yields on investment properties have already shown declines, as a record amount in construction of new apartments and housing is being completed over the next 2 years following a construction industry boom cycle. The perfect storm is brewing up in Australia right now at record speed. I would be surprised if property prices wouldn't fall by another 20% at least, following a decrease of 7% and 10% in 2018 in Melbourne and Sydney respectively, the two biggest Australian cities who account for a bulk of the Australian property market. Modeling the cost of renting versus owning in Melbourne. Many realize this today, but I had guessed this back in 2007 when I did my initial calculations on whether to buy the place I loved or keep renting it from my landlord. It was not worth buying in 2007 or today. I was renting a small but beautiful one-bedroom apartment in the Docklands, walking distance to the city centre, with magnificent views and excellent lighting, a large terrace, on a high floor, a monitored garage, a 3-lane 25 meters swimming pool, a modern gym, 2 saunas, and had all the fancy amenities you would expect to have living the expensive consumerism-driven life. I was working in a blue-chip international company, working my butt off to fund this lifestyle while saving moderately off my fancy paycheck. I thought for a couple of years, this would be a nice place to own, and started investing the process of purchasing it. Slowly the complete sum of varying cost items driving home ownership became clear to me. Banking fees, valuation fee, mortgage fees, mortgage insurance, building fees, strata/body corporate/building maintenance and administration fees/renovation fund, government, stamp duty and council fees/property taxes, legal, property deed transition fees, brokerage/agent fees, apartment fees, maintenance and upkeeping costs. The true cost of owning Australian property is simply put nuts. I couldn't believe my eyes when I added all these cost items up. My rent already was way smaller than the sum total of all these fees. It felt like I was supposed to be feeding the federal government, bankers, local government, agents and the entire construction industry 1% at a time. Eventually I decided against the purchase and kept renting the apartment for another 5 years. I avoided several rental increases, which were common quarterly or half-yearly at the time, by paying on time and generally taking good care of the investor's property. In the end of the 5 years I rented the apartment some $2,400 annually below the market value, and my landlord begged me to stay. He still made great money with me as he bought in before the market craze began, quite some time before I started looking. The table above shows you the difference between renting and owning a one-bedroom 54 square meter apartment in the Docklands since 2007. 5 years are actual costs and the rest is extrapolated based on real inflation. Had I purchased this particular, or similar, apartment, I would have been some $356,000 out of pocket after year 11 versus paying $249,000 over the same time period. Granted, I would have acquired some $93,000 in additional equity and a capital gain of $179,000, but it would have come at a cost of $355,818. This equates to a net loss of $3,219. Note that the council fees in particular have increased an average of 6% per annum during this period versus a modest inflation rate that was less than half on average. Instead of buying this property, I invested my property deposit plus the difference between the rental and ownership costs in a savings account, which basically generated the equivalent of a 6.35% effective return. All this sitting in a lame savings account over the same 11 years. Actually, this is a conservative view, as I was constantly optimizing my savings return, taking advantage of promotions offered by banks to attract deposits, which in turn they used to leverage off to provide home loans to others through the fractional reserve system. Instead, my deposit and savings from renting versus owning plus the lame savings account interest and cumulative gains came a long way, from initially $72,000 to $145,444 Australian dollars. I effectively doubled my initial deposit by sticking my savings in a low-yielding savings account versus buying the apartment. Of course, I didn't stop saving or earning money there. I focused on my career and continued leading a debt-free life, and later moved overseas. Today my net worth increased to well over 1.5 million Australian dollars while owning over 300 SQM of premium property spread across 5 rental units overseas, debt-free, and generating enough cash flow to live off nicely and continue to save and invest. However, my main goal these days is to grow and protect my assets, as I can see some dark clouds on the horizon. Also, would you believe me if I told you that combined my overseas properties attract less taxes and fees than this single 54 SQM Australian unit which I was contemplating to purchase back in 2007? The net rental yield for my Polish properties allow me to travel indefinitely and lead a financially free life, spending time with my loved ones, working on pet projects, work part-time in a physically demanding job with aim to keep fit, and developing myself. Owning a property in Australia was and still is an extremely costly proposition today, and it would have been a mistake to purchase it my personal situation. Be aware of all, hidden and ever-increasing, fees and taxes associated with buying a home before you commit to taking on large debt. In many cases the numbers don't stack up, especially if you compare it to the opportunity cost. Of course, there is many people who fared well during the property boom, and I don't want to dismiss their successes. Having said this, you're the master of your destiny and you should assess your situation individually. Last but not least, I want to paraphrase Warren Buffett, who once said, "Don't get into debt when young." For me that made most certainly sense. For freedom and to live your dreams. Your Financial Gladiator.